Welcome back, my friends. Today on the channel, we're going to do another question and answer video. So on the community tab of my YouTube channel, occasionally I'll put out a prompt such as this, asking for your questions. In the comments section, you can ask me anything about anything and then read each other's questions and thumbs up the ones you want me to respond to in a video. I'll try and respond to as many questions as I can. So the most thumbs up question is from Awesome HPT, and this is what he or she asks. There's a lot of talk that NATO and other partners are running low on things to send to Ukraine, despite their efforts to increase production. Do you think the situation is as critical as it is made out to be? And the short answer is no, I don't think it's that critical. But it is the job of the media and governments to sound alarmist. That's how you motivate a population. That's how you maybe motivate private enterprise to speed up their timetables. But here's an article with a very alarmist headline. Ukraine's counteroffensive delayed due to lack of equipment and ammunition. So I'm not sure if this is a winter counteroffensive that never occurred, or if Zelensky's talking about a spring counteroffensive, but I definitely think that the Ukrainians are going to start pushing late April, sometime in May, and they're going to have enough equipment and ammunition to do some damage. Here's another alarmist headline from CNN. Ukraine is burning through ammunition faster than the US and NATO can produce it inside the Pentagon's plan to close the gap. So every major Western industrial power is trying to solve this problem simultaneously. Army plans dramatic ammo production boost as Ukraine drains their stocks. So according to the U.S. Army Secretary, she told reporters that the U.S. will go from making 14,155 millimeter shells each month to 20,000 in the next couple months, but 40,000 by 2025, so within 2 years. But there's lots of other countries from the United Kingdom, France, Germany, the Czech Republic, Bulgaria. Everyone simultaneously is working to solve this problem in order to get Ukraine the ammunition they need this year. And when you look at the largest industrialized economies in the world, we're going to assume that China and India are neutral and they're not sending ammunition to the Russians. So we've got teamed up on the same side, the United States, Japan, Germany, the United Kingdom, France, Canada, Italy, and we'll even toss in South Korea. They're really good at making shells. Russia doesn't stand a chance. This is just a question of how much time it will take in order for Ukraine being resupplied to overtake the Russians. Russia on their own cannot keep pace with the defense production capabilities of all of these other countries. Next question. Hi Jake, this is a question that is less military focused and more civilian business centered. What has happened to the corporations and individuals who have had their properties physically destroyed? Have they had their loans, mortgages put on hold? And what if, after the war ends, there is no standing property, be it a factory, a store, a house, a car, an apartment? Where do these entities stand? So the short answer is, I don't know specifically about small things like a car, but I imagine that anything that someone has lost, they can maybe claim it as a write-off on their taxes for the future. I don't know what kind of protected status refugees have from debt and loans, but when we think big picture, I'll link this article down below, how Ukraine is managing a war economy. And I know that roughly the number to keep the Ukrainian government standing is about $5 billion a month in direct foreign aid. So the government is not going to fall. They have plenty of money. As for individuals and what's happening with their private property, this is something that's going to have to be sorted out after the war. I don't think anyone is going to jail at the moment for not being able to pay their bills. This is beyond their control. They're refugees or internal refugees if they've been displaced by the fighting. So I imagine that when the war is over and Russia is forced to pay reparations, there will be a very large pool of money, hopefully that can help people that lost their homes, lost their businesses, lost their private property. But how it's going today, I think it's a wait and see moment for a lot of these people who have lost their livelihoods and lost almost everything. Next question from Delta J. Do you agree with General Ben Hodges' view that taking Crimea is the road to victory for Ukraine? Is Ukraine currently capable of taking Crimea, and would that indeed be a sufficiently large blow to Russia's prestige that it could end the war, even if the Donbass hasn't been fully liberated? So I do agree generally that the Donbass region is the most difficult place for the Ukrainians to take, given how well the large cities of Donetsk and Luhansk are already integrated into Russia. I do think Ukrainians are going to go for the Donbass region last. So I do agree with General Ben Hodges that Ukraine can retake Crimea. All they have to do is get close to it, and then they can start unloading on these juicy military targets on the peninsula. And this is the big picture. I know waiting is difficult, but GLSDB from the United States is coming soon. So this article is from February, in which ground launch small diameter bombs, this is a joint project from Boeing and Saab, the contracts were signed in January. These are being produced right now. And these missiles, which can be launched from HIMARS, they have a 150-kilometer range. And the brilliance of this weapon system is how cheap it is. The per unit cost is about $50,000, and the United States has tens of thousands of these rocket motors and these dumb bombs. So Boeing and Saab is currently X-raying all of the rocket motors. They're very old to make sure they're safe to use, and then building the components to get these things paired together. So Ukraine just has to get close. They've got to retake the Kherson region, and then just start unloading on the peninsula. Hit everything that looks like a military target. The civilians will evacuate the peninsula on their own. I mean, there will be probably only a couple 100,000 people remaining on the peninsula before the Ukrainian military then finds a way to push in and retake the critical junctures. They don't have to storm into Sevastopol if the Russians really want to make a last stand there. They just have to cut them off and then starve them out. I don't think the Russians will last that long once Ukraine controls this part and controls this part up here. In addition to the Donbass region, I just want to say real quick, this war will end when Putin dies, or when Putin is taken into custody by his own people. So hopefully for these large cities of Donetsk and Luhansk, Ukrainians don't have to storm in there and start going building to building, block to block. That would be very devastating. But Russia did kind of do everyone a favor, and more or less the entire male population of the Donbass region has been wiped out. Russia, this region right here, the population was between 1 million and 1.5, and Russia force mobilized all the adult men that aren't being used for domestic security purposes, but they force conscripted all these men and then used them horribly. Poorly equipped, poorly trained, used in fruitless attacks. So how much resistance will these two cities offer once the Russian government gives up on this war and pulls back to their own borders? I'm hoping not a lot. Next question from Edard Wards. The question is, why hasn't Georgia and Moldova taken the opportunity to retake its occupied territory. Especially Moldova, it seems almost absurd at this point. I can only imagine it's Russians' hollow threats. So if you've not noticed these on the maps, there's this weird red border region occupied by the Russian military, in addition to these two territories down here. And the short answer why Georgia and Moldova are not militarily doing anything is they're tiny countries. Moldova is 2.6 million people, Moldova is 3.7, Russia's 144 million people. If Ukraine loses this war, then Georgia and Moldova are next. They're easy targets. So I think for the governments of Georgia and Moldova, if Ukraine wins, then more than likely Russia's going to have to pull their forces from these territories anyways. So what's the incentive for them to take government action? Now, Moldova and Georgia, they've been helpful. They've taken in a lot of refugees. There are volunteers from Georgia and Moldova fighting with Ukraine. But as far as their governments taking action, I think they've done their own cost-benefit analysis and they believe the risk is too great should Ukraine lose. They don't want to, be treated more brutally when the Russian military comes for them next. But if Ukraine wins, I think that'll be a huge win for these two governments as well. So what is the next question? What will happen to Russia's Black Sea fleet when Ukraine takes back Crimea? Well, hopefully their Black Sea fleet is at the bottom of the Black Sea because they've all been destroyed by GLSDB. But Russia can always retreat all of the ships out of the Black Sea. There's something called the Unified Deep Water System of Russia, and it's a canal system that the Soviets built that allows them to avoid NATO water. So going up the Volga into Russia proper, I don't know what these rivers over here are called, but all of these connect by a series of canals. So if Russia wants to retreat most of their ships from the Black Sea, they can take them to the Caspian Sea, they can take them to the Baltic Sea, or they can take them to the Arctic Ocean. So they can always just get them out of there if they really want to, or they can retreat to the coastline over here near Sochi. But I mean, if Ukraine retakes Crimea, I don't think they're going to let Russia keep any of their ships. So looking forward to that day. Next question. Speculative, what would be your strategy for a spring offensive? Where would you attack? What key goals would you pursue? And, Prigozhin made a video recently talking about what are Ukraine's three options. One was to attack Belgorod, and I don't think Ukraine's going to do that. I don't think they're going to use Challenger and Leopard tanks to go into Russia. I think that would upset the Europeans. And I don't think they should bother with all of this territory in Luhansk. This is mostly empty farm field. So the obvious line of attack is to get to the Sea of Azov coast. They've got to get to either Mariupol, Berdansk, or Melitopol and cut off this road corridor and rail line that resupplies Crimea and resupplies all the forces in Kherson. If Ukraine can find a way to punch to either Melitopol, Berdansk, or Mariupol, then I think all the Russian forces in Kherson will retreat back to Crimea. There's not a lot going on in this territory over here anyways, so it's impossible for them to effectively be resupplied, and they'll just go into conservation mode and retreat to Crimea at that point. So I think if Ukraine can get enough tanks and armored equipment, force something to happen, I do think the civilian population, especially in Melitopol, would be very happy to get rid of the Russians. Hopefully there's a resistance movement feeding information about locations that will aid in the spring counteroffensive. But we're going to get the pictures, we're going to get the videos, and this is going to be insane to watch. And I'm hoping it goes bad for Russia. Next question from Rusty Heyman. Why has Russia's economy been so relatively resilient as it has? And the short answer is that Putin spent 8 years saving all of his money for this war. It was the thing he wanted most in the world, to retake and absorb Crimea. So the estimates are that Putin saved up about $600 billion to fight this war. The goal was to survive Western sanctions. The war was only supposed to be 3 to 7 days. But he's now using the cash to keep his government afloat. And Putin did not tell his financial advisors that he was going to conduct this war because half of his reserves were being held in foreign banks when he invaded Ukraine, and the governments of France, Japan, Germany, US, UK, Australia, and Canada, they froze all of this money. So Russia still had $300 billion as of a year ago to keep everything going. But they are running huge monthly budget deficits, and it's not going to get any better for Putin's government. The other reason is the price of energy. The price of oil last summer was just astronomical, and the Russians made a good amount of money before the $60 G7 price cap went into effect. Russia's still making a very small profit on their oil exports, but not enough to be funding their governments for the rest of this year. In addition, the reason why there's no bank runs in Russia is because you're not allowed to take your money out of your Russian bank. They have withdrawal limits of a couple $1,000s, but if you have millions sitting in a Russian bank, you're not allowed to take it out. If you're a Western investor, you're not allowed to sell your property, you're not allowed to sell your stock, you're not allowed to sell anything. So it's really easy to stabilize your economy when nobody's allowed to sell anything. But the converse of that is nobody's investing, nobody's buying, because why would you be stupid enough to invest in Russia when you're not allowed to sell your investment or pull it out? Next question. Ukraine has been asking for fighter jets, but now they are saying that A-10 and Apaches will better fit their military strategy. What's your take on the effectiveness of these two weapons? I don't think the government of Ukraine has officially specified we want A-10s and Apaches. More or less, they're willing to take whatever Western allies are willing to give them. But when it comes to the A-10, I don't think this plane is ever going to be used in warfare again. When I commissioned as an officer in the Air Force in 2016, the A-10 was a controversial plane because we spend a lot of money keeping it in service when functionally I argue it doesn't serve a purpose anymore. Yeah, it's a really cool plane. This is a very big gun. This was designed, I think, in the 1970s with the intention of destroying Soviet armor. This plane is great as long as your adversary doesn't have any air defense systems. It's a very slow-moving plane that can take a lot of damage, don't get me wrong. It's designed to be riddled with bullet holes and continue to fly. But I think the United States maintains it because so many people like it. There's just a lot of pilots and maintainers, veterans that like this plane, which is why they keep it going when I argue the future of warfare is drones, and this plane I don't think is ever going to be used in warfare again. The DoD just can't bring themselves to cut the funding to retire this aircraft. I know I'm going to get some hate comments about this, but I don't think the United States is willing to donate these to the Ukrainians because they would just be immediately shot down by Russia's air defense systems. Next question. As the war gets longer, do you see it escalating into a world war? And no, I don't. When we look at World War II, you kind of need to have military allies in order for it to be a world war. So the Axis powers were Germany, Japan, Italy, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, Slovakia, Croatia, and Thailand. But the Allies just had more people and better economies. More or less, this is why the Allies won. And Russia today doesn't have any military allies. They've got Belarus, and even Lukashenko won't deploy his military. He will not attack Ukraine from the northern border. I'm sure Putin has told him he wants him to do this, but not even Lukashenko is willing to get in the fight. So China and India are not helping. Brazil, South Africa, when they talk about BRICS, these are not military allies that are going to come to Russia's defense. In addition, nobody's threatening Russia. If Russia just pulls out of Ukraine, retreats back to their own borders, the war is over. The sanctions aren't going away, but the hostilities should end. NATO is not trying to go to war with Russia. So no, I'm not really worried about World War III. I'm also not worried about a nuclear war. I've talked about this. You can check out my video, Why Russia Will Not Use Nuclear Weapons. Next question, will you go to Ukraine after the war is over? I definitely will be going to see all the destruction for myself. Love for you and the videos. Yeah, I would love to visit Ukraine once the war is over and it's safe. Yeah, I would like to make a trip and see some of the sights. It looks like a beautiful country. Next question, what happened to the ATACMS? I thought they were coming a while ago, as well as the Iron Dome. I don't know if Israel has officially committed to sending the Iron Dome, but they are beginning to cooperate more with probably intelligence the most, but specifically they might start sending stuff to counter Iran, because Iran is using drones that could potentially be used against Israel. Whatever Israel wants to donate, it's appreciated. As for ATACMS, these have never been officially promised, and I don't think the United States is ever going to send ATACMS. And the reason why is they've committed to sending GLSDB instead. And the main reason is cost. A single ATACMS missile is $1 million, whereas the per unit cost of GLSDB is about $50,000. It's just much cheaper. So what would Ukraine rather have? One ATACMS missile or 20 GLSDB bombs? Sure, the ATACMS can go 300 kilometers, but 20 GLSDB bombs at 150 kilometers is probably a better bang for your buck, basically. I do think President Biden is concerned that with the current Congress, he's not going to get any more direct military funding. So I do think the United States is trying to be cost effective with all of the aid they give, and ATACMS missiles are just too expensive. They would rather mass produce and send GLSDB instead. Here's a two-part question. How expensive is the maintenance of having nuclear weapons? Do you think Russia actually spends the money to do this? How can one dispose of a nuclear warhead? So let's start with number two. To dispose of a nuclear warhead, you just disassemble it. It's just a series of components and parts. You can take a warhead apart and then remove the enriched uranium, the fissile material, and recycle it into a civilian nuclear power program. I think when the Soviet Union collapsed, maybe it was called megatons to megawatts, converting nuclear weapons into civilian nuclear power programs. As for how expensive is it to maintain nuclear weapons, that's a complicated question. So here in the United States, we have something called the nuclear triad. This is the land-based leg, ICBMs, the submarines, and then the bombers. So here's fiscal year 2016 and what it costs to maintain the nuclear triad. This could be its own video in reality, but we spend a lot to maintain our nuclear deterrence, but the United States provides this nuclear umbrella, this protection to many of our allies, Japan, South Korea, Canada, etc. So I think it's worth it. I think nuclear weapons are part of the reason why we've not had a World War III in the last 80 years. Russia, if they were a rational actor, would have avoided this war because you can't fight and win a nuclear war. Therefore, they should never be fought. So what my job was in the United States Air Force is I was a launch officer. So I was part of the land leg of the nuclear triad. These are the Minuteman III intercontinental ballistic missile systems. So spread out across Montana, North Dakota, Nebraska, Colorado, and Wyoming, there's about 450 of these nuclear silos. And these silos are always on alert, 24/7, 365. In each one of these capsules controlling 10 to 20 of these silos, there's 2 launch officers just sitting down there. That's what I did for 4 years when I was stationed in North Dakota. I was about 80 feet underground in my pajamas, sitting at a console, monitoring nuclear weapons, waiting for a valid launch command from the President of the United States. Thankfully, it never happened, and hopefully it never happens. Now, when it comes to Russia, they might not be as dedicated to maintenance as we are here in the United States. I got to see what the maintenance requirements and schedule was like for our missiles, and it was difficult. It was challenging. It was expensive. So I am skeptical of the maintenance quality of Russian missiles, but they just have so many of them. Even if their failure rate, should they give a launch command, was 50%, I mean, they're still launching 2,500 of them successfully. So we can't rely on inoperability. We can't just say, well, hopefully they'll fail in the silos because they don't know how to maintain them. But yeah, it's a lot of nukes, and when this war with Ukraine is over, I think for sanctions to be lifted on Russia, they've got to get rid of their nuclear arsenal to a point. I think the United States is willing to reduce their stockpile significantly if Russia will get their nuclear stockpile down to comparable numbers to France, China, and the United Kingdom, like less than 1,000, but they can't have 6,000 anymore. They're too irresponsible. Next question, would you interview Roman? I've shown several clips recently of Roman, and I've been very careful on my channel not to interview people who have experienced trauma. Roman has seen people die. Roman has killed people. To try and interview him for an hour, I don't want to embarrass him. I don't want to put him on the spot. I don't want to ask him a difficult question that might trigger an emotional response. He's a human who has experienced warfare this last year on an unimaginable scale. So I've been very careful to avoid interviewing people who have experienced direct trauma, but in my opinion, there are other journalists out there with professional training and a staff that can help them craft questions and work through an interview without being inconsiderate of what these people have gone through. So because I'm not a professionally trained journalist, I'm just an amateur with a YouTube channel, I've been very careful not to interview soldiers and refugees. Am I open to doing it in the future? Potentially, but at the moment, I just don't feel comfortable and I don't feel confident talking to people in a podcast format who have experienced real trauma. I want to be considerate and respectful of them. That's my short answer. Next question, what are your plans for the channel once this conflict is over? And for those who don't know, if we go back in time a year, I was at about 100,000 subscribers, and I was talking about finance and investing. So if you scroll down on my channel, you'll find some of my old videos, how to read a stock chart, how to trade options, why the crypto market crashed. If the war ends abruptly, I could just go back to talking about finance and investing. I think that would be very cool. I think it's interesting and I enjoyed doing it. Or I could keep talking about geopolitics and international relations. I could talk about other conflict zones in the world, Iran, China, North Korea. Probably I'll do that. I think if there's not a hot conflict occurring, my viewership will drop, but that doesn't concern me. And honestly, guys, I've experienced so much success here from YouTube that I'm almost bigger than I think I should be. I'm kind of a low-key guy. I'm an introvert. I like keeping to myself, and the amount of attention that I get, on Instagram and Twitter and YouTube, it's a lot. And if it were to scale back or reduce by even 75%, I would still be a happy person doing my thing on YouTube. I'm happy occupying my niche and doing my own thing. Next question, do you think that China's, but also Russia's economies are actually real, or do you think, like I do, that they are fake economies that aren't as large or as well functioning as they seem? Yeah, I think the Communist Chinese Party lies about everything. I don't think their growth was inevitable given the size of their population. And to China's credit, they have lifted hundreds of millions of people out of abject poverty. But the problem that China has is the fallout from their one-child policy, plus rapid industrialization and urbanization. So I've recently read all 4 of Peter Zion's books this year. He has a lot of interesting theories. I don't have to agree with all of them in order to appreciate his strong arguments. And Peter Zion talks about the fate of every nation is pretty much determined by their geography and their demographics. And in the 50s and 60s under Mao Zedong and the Cultural Revolution, Mao wanted Chinese people to have as many children as possible. The Chinese communists in the 50s and 60s thought that having hundreds of millions of people to spare would help them win a nuclear war, should they go to the war with NATO or even war with the Soviet Union. So this terrified the Chinese government when Mao Zedong died, and then in the 70s and 80s, they switched to a one-child policy. And this has caused good economic benefits for the 90s and 2000s, given that there were fewer children to take care of. There also weren't that many old people because a lot of them died during the Chinese Civil War. But now their demographics have started to turn. After 40 or 50 years of the one-child policy, they're no longer having demographics capable of replacing their own population. So the Chinese population has peaked, and it's projected to continue to decline for the rest of the century. By, let's see here, 2080, they'll be under 1 billion people. And when it comes to economies, when your population ages and contracts, this is usually devastating for your investment portfolio. So China is going to have a shrinking pool of workers, they're going to have a shrinking tax base, and they're going to have more aging people who can't work anymore to take care of. So these are going to be huge economic problems for China. Do I think their economy numbers are fake today? Yeah, they're probably embellished by like 10 or 20%. I think all of these party officials lie about everything to meet their quotas. Final question. I just wanted to toss this one in here. Hey Jake, big fan of your videos. I was wondering, do you currently have a girlfriend or wife? Would you like to have a family of your own at some point? And do you think you will always be living in the USA? More or less, yeah, I think I'll always remain living in the United States. It's not a perfect place, but it's still a good place to live. As for, do I have a wife or girlfriend? I am currently single. I'm currently 38 and single. But I do want to meet someone. I do want to get married. I do want to have kids. Hard to believe, right? This guy right here is Single. But if you want a synopsis of my life story, after graduating college, I went to work as an English teacher in South Korea. Absolutely loved the lifestyle, loved the culture, loved the people. I lived there for 6 years, teaching both elementary school as well as other teachers. So these are all Korean English subject teachers, and I was able to, during the day, work in an elementary school, and then in the afternoons and evenings, I would teach both other native teachers like me as well as Korean teachers English. Fantastic experience all around. These are some of my friends from my time living in South Korea. It was a unique opportunity because I was able to meet and interact with other native English-speaking people from the other English-speaking countries. So my time in South Korea, I made friends from Canada, the United Kingdom, Australia, New Zealand, the Philippines, India, South Africa. Really cool experience. I then moved back to the United States and commissioned as an officer in the Air Force. This is how I got into being a launch officer. Once again, fantastic experience, no complaints. The job was very difficult, but it was a very rewarding experience. And why am I single? And it's probably because I've moved around so much. I don't know if I'm giving you guys too much information here, but I had several long-term relationships, but they always seem to end when either I have to move or they have to move, and here we are. But now I live in Vegas, and I should probably start dating again. All right, that's all for this question and answer. Maybe I gave you guys too much information. I'll try and do another one next month, as I think these are fun to do. Until the next one, take care, everybody.